In 1994, a family made a decision most families never have to face. They asked the government to dig up their father's grave. Frank Olson had been dead for over 40 years by then. The official story said he jumped. A troubled scientist, overwhelmed by depression, ended his life by falling from a hotel window in New York City. That was the story his wife raised her children on. That was the story the family had grudgingly accepted even after learning decades later that the CIA had secretly drugged him with LSD just days before his death. But when medical examiners finally opened that casket and studied what remained, they found something the official story could never explain: an injury to the skull, the kind of wound consistent with being struck before he ever went through that window. The medical examiner's conclusion wasn't suicide. It wasn't an accident. It was homicide. So the question this family had been asking for 40 years suddenly had a very different weight to it. If Frank Olson didn't jump, who made sure he fell? And why would the United States government let his family bury him under a lie for 4 decades? To understand how a government scientist ends up dead on a New York sidewalk with a fractured skull and an official cover story, you have to go back to a moment when Washington was gripped by a very specific kind of fear. It was the early 1950s. American soldiers were coming home from Korean prisoner of war camps saying things nobody expected. Praising communism, denouncing their own country, confessing to crimes they hadn't committed. To U.S. intelligence, there was only one explanation that made sense at the time. The enemy had found a way to control the human mind. And if that was true, America needed that weapon first. On April 13, 1953, the CIA's director, Allan Dulles, authorized a program that would chase that fear for the next 2 decades. It was called MKUltra. The name itself was almost meaningless by design. A random prefix bolted onto a word pulled from a dictionary, chosen specifically so it would reveal nothing if anyone ever heard it. The man Dulles put in charge was a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. He had a clubfoot, he stuttered, he raised goats and loved folk dancing. Nothing about him looked like a man who would spend the next 20 years experimenting on human beings without their consent. But looks, as this story proves again and again, tell you almost nothing about what a person is capable of. Gottlieb was given something rare inside the CIA: freedom from oversight. He could approve projects with almost no paperwork. He could fund experiments without anyone above him asking too many questions. And what he built with that freedom was staggering in scale. Investigators would later count at least 149 individual subprojects, spread across more than 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, and even pharmaceutical companies. Most of them with no idea their research was being quietly funded and directed by the CIA. At the center of almost everything was a drug barely anyone outside a laboratory had heard of. LSD. Gottlieb became so obsessed with its potential that in the early 1950s, the CIA arranged to buy the entire available supply from a Swiss pharmaceutical company for the modern equivalent of over $4 million. He wasn't just buying a chemical. He was trying to buy control over who got to study it at all. But here is where the story turns genuinely disturbing. Gottlieb didn't want to study LSD only in controlled lab settings with willing subjects. He wanted to know what it would do to people who had no idea it was coming. Inside CIA safehouses in San Francisco, an operation known as Operation Midnight Climax lured unsuspecting men off the street with the promise of an evening with a woman, only to dose their drinks with LSD and film their reactions from behind one-way mirrors. These were ordinary men, Men with no criminal history, no connection to intelligence work, no reason to expect that their government had any interest in them at all. And it didn't stop with strangers in bars. It moved into places where people had even less power to say no. In Kentucky, patients at an addiction research center were given LSD for weeks at a time, in one documented case for 174 straight days. Some of these patients were addicts who were offered more of the drugs they were already dependent on in exchange for participating. That isn't consent. That's exploiting desperation and calling it research. But the real story gets darker still because MKUltra didn't stay inside American borders. In Montreal, a psychiatrist named Ewen Cameron was quietly funded by a CIA front organization to pursue something he called psychic driving. Cameron believed he could erase a person's existing personality entirely and rebuild it from nothing. His method involved massive doses of LSD and barbiturates, combined with electroshock therapy delivered at up to 40 times the normal power, while patients lay in drug-induced comas for weeks, sometimes months, listening to the same recorded phrase looped over and over through speakers beside their heads. Here's what makes this even more disturbing. Many of Cameron's patients hadn't come to him for anything close to what he did to them. They arrived with anxiety, with postpartum depression. Ordinary struggles that ordinary people seek help for. They left if they were lucky enough to leave functioning at all, unable to recognize their own parents, unable to remember how to speak, some convinced that the doctors torturing them were their real family. Cameron died of a heart attack in 1967 while mountain climbing with his son. His own family destroyed his private record shortly afterward. For years, that meant almost nothing about what really happened inside that institute could be independently verified. It took until the 1980s for a Canadian news program to expose what Cameron had done, and even then, the Canadian government's own involvement in funding his continued research complicated the victim's fight for justice for years afterward. As recently as 2025, a Quebec court authorized a new class action lawsuit tied to those experiments, meaning survivors are still fighting for accountability more than 60 years later. Back in the United States, MKUltra kept reaching into places that would eventually stun the public. A Stanford graduate student named Ken Kesey volunteered for a study that turned out to be CIA-funded, taking LSD and reporting his experiences at a veterans hospital. What he experienced there didn't stay in a lab report. It shaped the novel that became One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and it helped ignite an entire counterculture movement that Gottlieb ironically never intended to create. But not every documented connection is so strange and celebrated. At Harvard, a psychology researcher ran a deliberately brutalizing experimental study on a group of undergraduates, subjecting each of them to roughly 200 hours of psychological stress testing. One of those students was a young man named Ted Kaczynski, years before the world would come to know him as the Unabomber. Whether that experience shaped what came later is something historians still argue about. But the documented fact that it happened at all is enough to make you pause. And then there's the story former mob boss Whitey Bulger told publicly decades later, claiming he had been given weekly injections of LSD while incarcerated in the 1950s as part of ongoing testing. Part of the same web of experimentation that reached into American prisons across the country. So the question becomes, how big was this program really? How many people, famous and forgotten, walked through some corner of MKUltra without ever fully understanding what had been done to them? We may never know the full answer, and that is not an accident. It's the result of a decision made in 1973, in the middle of the chaos surrounding Watergate. CIA Director Richard Helms, worried about what investigators might eventually find, gave an order. Destroy the MKUltra files. Thousands of documents, records of test subjects, results, methods, decades of evidence were shredded and burned. An agency that had spent 20 years trying to erase and rewrite the human mind now tried to erase its own memory from history. For a moment, it nearly worked. But in 1977, a Freedom of Information Act request stumbled onto something Helms's purge had missed. A set of roughly 20,000 pages, financial records mostly, had been mistakenly filed in a records center that wasn't meant to store anything related to MKUltra. They survived purely by administrative accident. Those surviving pages became the foundation for the Church Committee hearings, where the CIA's own deputy director admitted under oath that over 30 institutions had been involved in testing drugs on unwitting citizens. In his words, at all social levels, high and low. Senator Frank Church's committee reached a conclusion that should stop anyone in their tracks. Prior consent was obviously not obtained from any of the subjects. Sidney Gottlieb himself sat before that committee. He claimed he barely remembered any of it. He retired quietly, faced no criminal charges, and died in 1999, having spent the final decades of his life largely out of public view. Frank Olson's family received a $750,000 settlement and a public apology from President Ford in 1975, back when they still believed his death was simply a drug-induced accident. It wasn't until the 1994 exhumation revealed that fractured skull that they understood how much of the truth had never been told to them at all. In 2012, the family sued the federal government directly, alleging Olson hadn't fallen at all, that he had become a security risk who knew too much and had to be silenced. The lawsuit was dismissed the following year, but the judge who dismissed it wrote something remarkable in his ruling. He said the public record supported many of the family's allegations, no matter how far-fetched they sounded. Think about what that means. A federal judge forced by law to throw out the case still felt compelled to say the disturbing version of events might actually be true. And the story still isn't finished. In 2026, declassified documents reported by investigative journalists revealed that Korean War prisoners had been subjected to CIA experimentation even earlier than previously understood, under a program that predated MKUltra entirely, built with the explicit goal of controlling a person to the point where they would act against their own instinct for self-preservation. 70 years later, we are still finding pieces of this story that were supposed to have been burned to nothing in 1973. So here's the question worth sitting with long after this documentary ends. If 20,000 pages survived only because of a filing mistake, what does that tell us about everything that didn't survive? About the records that were destroyed exactly as planned, with no accident to save them, no lawsuit to force them into daylight, no forensic exam to prove what really happened. The most disturbing part of MKUltra was never just what the government finally admitted to. It's everything they succeeded in making sure we would never be able to prove at all.